Welcome to WeakNet.Academy. I am your instructor, Douglas Berdeaux. In this video lesson, we're going to be taking a look at how we can easily set up a WPA2 Enterprise security-enabled wireless network. To set up this wireless network, we're going to be using a cheap Wi-Fi router and a Raspberry Pi 4. This video lesson will be broken up into three simple parts. In part 1, we'll be learning about the hardware. In part 2, we'll be learning about Radius and LDAP and how they are used in conjunction with the WPA2 Enterprise Wireless Network. The third part of this lesson will be a simple screen capture in which you can follow along with me as I set up LDAP Radius and configure the wireless router to use Radius as its authenticator and set it up for WPA2 Enterprise. We will in fact be adding users using LDIF files to LDAP. And finally, we will test the connection once it's all set up and ready. So let's first talk about the hardware required for this video lesson. Again, you can purchase this hardware from anywhere online or in any physical store. I highly recommend purchasing it for the lowest cost possible because this is simply going to be set up and used in a penetration testing lab environment. I did not actually purchase mine from Amazon, but I will be showing screenshots of it just to show pictures of the hardware. So we're going to be starting with the wireless router itself. And I chose to use a Linksys E2500 Advanced Simultaneous Dual Band Wireless N router. As you can see, it's about $34 USD. And this router is a dual band router. And what that means is that it can operate on the 2.4 gigahertz ISM band, or it can also operate on the 5 gigahertz uniband. And it can operate on both bands at the same time. You get to choose within the administration wireless router interface. Next, we have a Raspberry Pi. Now, I'm using the Raspberry Pi 4 SC15184, and then I am actually in fact using the 4 gigabyte version, which is $61 USD on Amazon. Again, if you could find this cheaper anywhere else, I highly recommend purchasing it from there. I am in no way affiliated with Amazon. I am just using these screenshots for examples. Now, the reason why I used the 4 gigabyte version is just to ensure that I wasn't coming into any issues with slowness, because we are using this system as an authenticator. And honestly, it was just the latest version, so that's why I chose it. Now, I also had to purchase a small set of fans, and the small set of fans ran me about $8. And you can also purchase a case for this, and the case will also be about $8. So if I highly recommend adding in the fans in the case just to keep the system cool, because the cooler it is, the faster it actually runs. If you add heat to any circuit, you're ultimately going to cause resistance, and resistance is slowness within circuits. And if you think about it, a computer circuit means that the computer itself will be slow as it gets hotter. So that's it for the hardware. We're also going to need a couple of Ethernet cables, obviously, to connect the Raspberry Pi to the wireless router and connect the Raspberry Pi to the internet. And we'll also be connecting our laptop to the wireless router itself to configure it. Now, I'm doing all of this just simply using 2 Ethernet cables. And during the configuration process, I will be showing diagrams of how to configure those 2 cables. So let's now take a minute to talk about LDAP. What is LDAP? Well, LDAP actually stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, and LDAP itself is a directory service. This means that it is basically a huge database full of all of your users' information. The user's information is stored in something called records, and each record is going to contain information that's completely intrinsic to that user. For instance, I have a record in LDAP, you would have a record in LDAP. Whenever I go to authenticate to a wireless WPA2 Enterprise network, the authenticator mechanism, which will be Radius, will go to LDAP and say, is this username and this password for this user correct? LDAP will search for my record, check my username, and check my password, and then return to Radius saying yes or no using accept or reject messages. So what other kind of data is stored in the user records? Well, you can have a first name attribute, you can have a last name attribute, you can have a display name attribute, you can have your user's email address attribute. I highly recommend not storing PII or personally identifiable information, but LDAP also stores a protected version of the user's password. So again, whenever somebody tries to authenticate to our WPA2 wireless security enabled network, the wireless router is going to be pointing to our Radius server. The Radius server is the authenticator who is then going to query LDAP and say, we have a user trying to authenticate with our network. Here is the username, and here is the password. LDAP's going to look for that user's record and check for that username and see if the password matches what was passed to the Wi-Fi router and ultimately Radius. Once Radius gets this message from LDAP, it will tell the wireless router to either allow the person onto the network or not allow them onto the network. One last thing I'd like to mention, just to be a little bit thorough, even though this is a brief introduction into LDAP, just like any other database, such as an RDBMS from Oracle using the SQL query language, there is also a type of query language just specifically for LDAP. LDAP also has a filter language in which you can actually create filters, and they're usually parentheses, and the very first character within the parentheses may be a pipe, it may be an ampersand, and that would stand for OR logic or AND logic, and then you'll have nested parentheses. And again, this is just filter syntax, and I'm just mentioning this just to be thorough. We're not going to be writing any of these queries or the syntax. We're going to be leaving that up to Radius itself. So what is Radius? Why do I keep saying Radius? Well, Radius is a really long acronym, actually. It stands for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. And again, this is going to use LDAP as the centralized database to authenticate all of the users by simply asking LDAP to check a username and password. Radius also does a couple other things in which we call the AAA. Radius is an authenticator. It's going to handle all of our authentication. It's going to handle all of the authorization, including the roles, which are going to come from LDAP. And it's also going to handle accounting. Now, by accounting, I don't mean checking accounts to see if accounts are okay. I'm actually referring accounting is actually referring to the act of actually accounting for an action or logging an action for non-repudiation purposes, which means that somebody can't really say that they didn't do something that they did, or somebody can't say that they did do something that they didn't do. And again, Radius is going to be simply just the authenticator service. And what we're going to do is actually have our Wi-Fi router point to the Raspberry Pi, and it's going to point to the Radius service on the Raspberry Pi. Now, the Raspberry Pi is also going to handle the LDAP. So the two services, LDAP and Radius, will both be installed, configured, and running on the Pi itself. And usually in large networks, this isn't the case. Usually in large networks, your LDAP server may be completely different from your actual Radius server. It could be its own physical server, it could be virtualized, it could have multiple instances of LDAP, multiple instances of Radius, and it could be even using something like load balancing. So for us, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to use our cheap Wi-Fi router and our simple Raspberry Pi, and let's now continue on and configure LDAP and Radius. Now, one thing to note is that I'm assuming that you have already installed the Raspbian OS onto your Raspberry Pi. This is very easy. All you have to do is search Google or go out to raspberrypi.org and download the Windows installer for the Raspberry Pi Imager. And this tool is super convenient, and it just allows you to simply choose the operating system that you have downloaded from raspberrypi.org, and then choose your SD card, and it does all of the work for you. Once you're done, you pull the SD card out, put it into the Raspberry Pi, and plug it into an internet-enabled network. Now, this is important. The Raspberry Pi needs to be on the internet while we're configuring it, because we're going to have to pull packages down, and we're going to have to update the Raspberry Pi system itself. Okay, so now let's set up LDAP together. Now, one thing to note before we start is that I'm going to be configuring my hardware in a specific manner, and I drew diagrams to show exactly what it looks like. This is my laptop right here, which is running Daemon Linux in a virtualized environment. It is connected to the internet, as you can see. The Raspberry Pi is also connected to the internet, and they're both on the same exact VLAN inside of this Soho Wi-Fi router that you see here. This is our E25 router. We're not going to be using this just yet. We just want these two items, the Raspberry Pi and the laptop, to be on the same network so that I can access the Raspberry Pi and I could do things like update the operating system, install LDAP, and install Radius and configure both of them. Once we're done, we'll be changing the configuration of this network, and I'll show you with the next diagram. The first thing that I want to do, now that the Raspberry Pi is plugged in, I'm going to simply grab an IP address again, And now I'm going to try to ping the Raspberry Pi just so I could figure out what IP address it's using. As we can see, it's 192.168.1.23. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to SSH, which means I'm going to create a remote connection using just the terminal to the Raspberry Pi. Now by default, the Raspberry Pi login credentials are the username of Pi, P-I, and the password is Raspberry. I'm going to type yes to accept the Raspberry Pi's SSH certificate, which is brand new. I type the word Raspberry and I'll be logged in. Now, to do everything else from here, I'm going to have to become root. I need to be the administrator just simply so that I can update all of the packages and the operating system itself. Now this part's very important. You always want to have the latest updates, especially since we are essentially turning our Raspberry Pi into a network security appliance. So I'm going to type sudo su to become root. As you can see, the prompt has changed and it now says root instead of Pi. I'm going to do @update. And what this is going to do is pull down all of the latest package repository information. And by packages, I'm talking about programs, which are going to include LDAP and the LDAP utilities and Radius and the Radius utilities. Okay, now we can see that a lot of packages can actually be upgraded. So now what I'm going to do is type apt upgrade. When I'm prompted, I'm going to type Y for yes and hit enter. And we can see all of the packages that are going to be upgraded. Great! Once this is done, I can go ahead and install LDAP and the LDAP utilities package. And to do so, I'm going to do apt install slapd and LDAP-utils. And I'm just going to append a -y. And this is going to skip the part where it prompts you saying, would you like to install these packages? Now this will prompt you for an administrator password. And as you can see, it's for LDAP. Slapd is the actual LDAP service. You could type anything here because we're going to be changing this once we reconfigure LDAP. Now we need to reconfigure LDAP just so we can configure all of the settings all in one place. And to do so, we're going to do dpackage-reconfigure slapd. The first thing it's going to ask you is whether or not you want to enable an option or no initial configuration for database will be created for you. So what we're going to do is choose no. On the next one, it's going to ask you the DNS domain name. And for this, I'm going to do lab.weaknetlabs.com. Now this is important. If you change this, if you're not using lab.weaknetlabs.com, you're going to have to be updating a couple of files that you're going to be downloading from WeakNet.Academy before actually using the LDAP add utility that comes from the LDAP utils package whenever we go to actually add user records into LDAP. And we're going to be taking a look at that once we get there. But again, this is going to be very important and you're going to want to write this down or remember this for later. The next thing it's going to ask me is for my organization name. And for my organization, I'm just simply going to type the word lab. Now it's going to prompt us for the same password again, and it's not asking us to check the password we put in before. It's actually just going to take whatever we put in here now and just reset the administrator password again. I'm just going to do password 1 with a capital P, just to make things easy. Now, this one right here is kind of tricky. I always choose MDB, and what this means is that the MDB backend is going to be the new storage format. It requires less configuration than BDB and HDB, and it just seems like it's, if by reading the dialogue here, it just seemed like it was recommended to me. I'm going to hit OK. Now, I'm using the tab key, by the way, to move the cursor around. So I'm going to hit OK. And do you want the database to be removed when slapd is purged? And for me, I'm just going to do no for this. And then the next question, we're going to do yes. And there are still files in here, which will probably break the configuration process. Do you want to move the old database? And yes, because we're going to be creating a very new database, which is going to contain all of our user records. I'm going to hit yes, and that completes the configuration of LDAP as far as installing it. But what we just did was configure the LDAP service itself and not the actual directory. So finally, I'm going to test this with a command that we got from LDAP-utils called LDAP search, and I'm going to pass lowercase x as an argument, 3 capital L's as in lovely for the second argument. The third argument is going to be b for our base, dn, and for our base dn I'm going to put dc equals lab, comma, dc equals weaknet labs, comma, dc equals com. I'm going to hit enter, and we can see that this was in fact successful. It does spit out a common name right here, cn equals admin. This whole thing right here is actually the username, which we'll be using to query LDAP. So now what we need to do next is add user records. We need to add users and groups into our LDAP directory service to build out the directory itself. This way, when we go to authenticate to the router, which checks the radius service, and the query goes to LDAP, we know that the username and password will in fact be within that user record. So I've actually built out a set of LDIF files, which we'll be using, along with the LDAP add command that you can pull down from WeakNet.Academy. So first, I'm going to cd into /temp, which is the Linux temporary directory. Remember, I am not in daemon Linux right now. I am on the Raspberry Pi. As you can see, the host name here is not daemon, it's Raspberry Pi. I'm going to create a directory, and I'm going to call it LDAP. I'm going to cd into LDAP, and then I'm going to use the wget command, which means I'm fairly certain stands for webget, and I'm going to get the file https weaknet.academy /files/ldap-add.tar.gz. So if I type ls, that just simply shows the files in the current directory that I am in. So let's go ahead and do tar/vzxf, and what this is going to do is unzip the LDAP file that we just downloaded. tar.gz. If you don't feel like typing out all of these letters right here, you can also just use tab to autocomplete, another awesome convenience built into the Born Again shell. I'm going to hit enter, and we're going to see that all of the files were in fact extrapolated from the actual gzip file. I'm going to type ls, and you can see all of these files. Now, just to keep things clean, I'm going to remove the actual zip file itself. Type ls again, so we only have LDIF files. Now, we're going to be using these LDIF files to place records and groups into our directory service, our LDAP service. Before we do so, I highly recommend to open each one of these with a text editor, and you can use Vim. For instance, I'll do apt install Vim, and I'm going to install Vim, and I'm going to show you how to use Vim to open a file and to look at it and edit it. And the reason why you need to open these and edit these is because if you did in fact not choose lab.weaknetlabs.com as your domain host or your domain name, then you're going to have to update these files. I'll type ls again so we can see these files. And the first one that we're going to be adding is we're going to be adding a people OU. So we're going to choose this one right here. LDAP-add-people-OU. Now I'm going to type the word Vim, and I'm going to paste in the file name and hit enter. And this shows the contents of the file. Now you can use your arrow keys to look at this and to move the cursor around. And again, if you need to change this lab, weaknetlabs.com, to do so, you just simply hit the I for insert, and then you can actually use the backspace key and you can type and edit everything perfectly fine. Whenever you're completely done with all of your edits, hit escape, and then hold shift and hit colon and type WQ and hit enter. And that's it. That will write the file and write all of your changes. Now I chose lab.weaknetlabs.com as my domain, so I'm going to leave it the way it is. And what I'm going to do now is type LDAP add, and I'm going to do -x as we did before, -W, -D, and now I'm going to put my admin username. Now again, the admin username is the CN. So I'm going to do CN equals admin, comma, DC equals lab, comma, DC equals weaknet labs, comma, DC equals com. And now again, that whole string right there is the actual username. That's going to be the actual CN. So what I'm going to put next is -f for file, and then we're going to do LDAP-add people OU, the file that we just opened and just used. And when I hit enter, I'm going to be asked for the administrator password, this password right here, for LDAP itself. I set mine to password with a password1 with a capital P. Great. We didn't get any error message, so the new entry, the OU, or organizational unit of people, was then added into LDAP. So now that we have an organizational unit, the next thing we're going to do is add a group to that organizational unit. And for the group, we're going to do vim LDAP-add groups-ou.ldiv. I'm going to hit enter, and again, if you made any changes to your domain, do it here, hit the insert key, arrow over to where you want to change, use your backspace key, use your enter key, do whatever you need to do, and then hold shift, hit colon, and type WQ and enter. So since I did not make any changes, I used lab.weaknet.labs, I can actually hit the up arrow key to grab the last LDAP add command that I used, and all I have to do is change LDAP add, the file name at the very end. When I hit enter, I'm prompted again for the password. Hit enter, and we did not receive an error message, which means we now have a group. We have a group inside of our directory. We have an organizational unit inside of our directory. This is kind of exciting. Now, what we get to do next is add a user. And I'm going to be adding a user named WeakNet. So let's do vim, and we're going to look at this file, LDAP add. I think it's, oh, here it is, dn. LDAP add dn. Great. So if you did not want to add the user WeakNet, you have to change the UID right here, because this file right here specifies all of the key value attributes of the actual record that will be inserted into LDAP. All of this information right here will be my user record. So my user ID, which is username, these need to be unique. That's pretty much what IDs means. And so I'm starting off with a WeakNet user. I'm placing that WeakNet user into the organizational unit people. And I'm also placing them into the base DN of lab weaknetlabs.com, lab.weaknetlabs.com. You could skip over these object class attributes, and we could go down to UID and see the UID is specified again. The surname or last name is Academy. The given name or first name is WeakNet. The CN is pretty much the same as the display name, and also the geckos are all just the full name itself. WeakNet's full name is WeakNet.Academy. The UID needs to be unique, and the GID needs to be unique. Now these are analogous to a user ID or a group ID in Linux itself. For instance, the UID of root is usually 0. The group ID of root is also usually 0. Whenever you add new users to a Linux system, they usually start around 500 or 1,000. So I just chose to make mine completely unique, and I'm not going to be adding any other users to my WPA2 wireless security-enabled network. Finally, we're going to add a login shell and a home directory and a user password. So for this password, I'm actually going to change this. I'm going to make this password 123, lowercase password p 123. Now I'm going to hit escape, hold shift, hit colon, type WQ for write and quit. It has to be in that order. You can't do QW. And hit enter. And now I'm going to hit up to go back into our history here and conveniently pull out the last LDAP add command that I had used. And I'm just simply going to change the file to now be dn-add, dn period. This is important. You can't add a dn to a group without the dn existing. So I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to type in the password. And that's it. LDAP's completely done. We are done with LDAP. Now we could use an LDAP search command and search for this user, but we didn't get any error output, so I'm 100% sure that the user's in there perfectly fine. Next, we're going to move on to Radius. So to install Radius, we're going to be using the same apt command. Again, remember, we are on the Raspberry Pi. We have a remote connection to the Raspberry Pi. I am not on this Linux system right now in this terminal. I'm actually connected to the Raspberry Pi as root. I'm going to be using apt update to ensure that I do get the latest updates. Next, I need to do apt install free radius which is the radius service itself, free radius hyphen utils, which is going to include tools for us to connect to free radius to make a test query. And then the very last one is super important. We need to do free radius hyphen LDAP, which is going to install the LDAP module that free radius will use to make the connection to LDAP. If we forget that step, free radius won't know how to connect to LDAP. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to do Y when prompted. And once this is done installing, we're actually not going to configure the service itself. We're going to configure the radius server itself. Okay, great. So this did take quite a long time. I'd say about 5 minutes. And you could see up here, if you scroll up here, you could see that what this was doing right here, this was generating a Diffie-Hellman parameter, which was a 124-bit long safe prime. So this took a pretty much the majority of the time during the installation. So once we now have this installed, we no longer need the internet for our Raspberry Pi. So if need be, you can safely remove your Raspberry Pi from your internet-enabled network and place it onto a private network or inside of your penetration testing lab, as long as you have access to it from your laptop here, like this laptop itself. I'm not going to be moving mine for right now. Again, remember, if you do, you're going to have to search for the IP address of the Raspberry Pi, because it will in fact change if you change the Raspberry Pi to a different physical or a virtual network. And you could do so by using ping Raspberry Pi. And once you get that IP address, remember, you're going to have to make another remote connection in your terminal using SSH, just as we did before. Now, your SSH key won't change, but once you make the SSH terminal connection to the Raspberry Pi, ensure that you do sudo su to become root, because we're going to be changing configuration files inside of a private directory called /etc. So let's start that now. We're going to be using Vim again, and we're going to type /etc/free radius. Remember, you can use tab for auto completion 3.0. And the first one we're going to update is the available sites. Sites available, default. And what I'm going to do is do a search. Now, to do a search in Vim, you do not enter insert mode. You keep it in this mode right here. You hit the / key, and I'm going to type capital A. This is case sensitive, by the way. Lowercase UTH hyphen capital T YPE enter. Now, it found one result so far. I'm going to hit the N key, and the N key again, and the N key again until I come down to an actual section, which is going to show the auth type right here. And as you can see, this part right here, let me show the line number, set number, is on line 481. So it's pretty far down in the configuration file itself. And what I'm going to do is keep going, use the N key again until I can find LDAP. Here it is. As you can see, LDAP is commented out. It is in blue. So what I'm going to do is, remember, I'm not in insert mode yet. I didn't type I. I'm in the edit mode. So I can hit the X key on some of these bang symbols right here, and it's going to simply remove them. And you'll see that the color changes here to a nice cream color, which means that it is now uncommented, so that whenever this configuration file is read by free radius, these lines will in fact take effect. So I'm going to hit escape, hold shift, type :WQ, enter, and it will save my changes. Done. We're done with the first file. The next file that we're going to edit is vim space /etc free radius 3.0, and this next one is going to be the mods available and the LDAP file. Now in this file, we're just going to be changing a few attributes right here inside of the LDAP section, which starts with the word LDAP and the curly brace. Now this is not like JSON. As you can see, there aren't commas in here. The curly brace just signifies a block of configuration attributes. The first one, server, I'm going to change to 127.0.0.1, and then we can see that the identity is commented out, so I'm going to remove this comment line character right here, and I'm going to change my identity to include my base DN, which is going to be lab, comma DC equals WeakNet Labs, comma DC equals com. Now remember, if you had changed this domain you're going to want this base right here. You're going to want to update this to whatever you chose. I just left mine as lab.weaknetlabs.com during the initial configuration of LDAP. And so I'm going to now uncomment out the password, and I'm going to put in the password of password1 for this username right here, cn equals admin. And then the last thing I'm going to update is the base dn. Again, I'm just going to simply put lab, comma, dc equals weaknetlabs, comma, dc equals com. And that's it for this file. Hit escape, hold shift, hit colon, type W, Q, and then hit enter. And now all of our changes have been saved to the radius configuration file. The next thing we need to do is create a symbolic link. Now this symbolic link is going to help move one of our mods that are available, the LDAP module, into the enabled section of the free radius configuration. So I'm going to do ln space -s for symbolic / etc / radius / 3.0 / mods available / LDAP. And we're going to create the symbolic link, as I said before, into free radius 3.0 / mods enabled. And you don't type LDAP, well, you do type LDAP here. And what this is going to do is just simply create a symbolic link. So whenever the actual initial configuration of free radius starts and it's reading through the configuration, it's going to look into this directory to see what mods are enabled, and it's going to see LDAP. And it's going to read the contents of this file right here because, again, this is a symbolic link. We're not copying the file into this directory. We're just basically putting a shortcut to it. So I'm going to hit enter, and once that is done, we can stop free radius with / etc / init.d / free radius stop, because the service does in fact start when you install it. So now that it's stopped, I'm going to start it with free radius -X. Now if something is wrong here, it's going to tell us that something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. We do not see any red text. We do see that the process is ready to accept a request and it's working. Now to test it, I'm going to simply open up a new terminal here. And if you have the free radius utility installed on your daemon Linux, you could do this from here as long as you know the IP address of your Pi. What I'm going to do is just simply SSH into the Pi again. 68.1.23, and the password is raspberry. And now I'm connected to the Pi again. I'm going to do sudo su to become root. So now what I'm going to be doing is using radtest, which is a tool that was included with the free radius -utils package that we installed earlier. And I'm going to pass the username that I created whenever I use the LDIF file for the DN, as we used before, to add the WeakNet user into LDAP. And then I'm going to type the password, which was password123. And then what I'm going to type next is 127.0.0.1. And then I'm going to type 1 and then testing 123. And again, what's going to happen now, just to diagram this out, is that we're passing these credentials to Radius, and Radius is going to take these credentials and query LDAP and say, does this user exist? If this user does exist, is this his or her password? And then LDAP is going to respond with either a message accept or message reject to Radius, which will then spit out onto our screen. This right here is the host name as to where Radius is actually running. This is where the service is running. Radtest connects to Radius, not LDAP. And then this right here is going to equal the default port, I believe, and you just put in, I think, 0 or 1 should work. So now what I'm going to do is hit enter, and we can see from up here a lot of information was spat out. It's starting with these zeros right here in this run LDAP. And what's happening is this is actually logging and accounting. And what's saying is I got these credentials, which is the username and the password, and the NAS IP address and the port. And now what I'm going to do is make a connection to LDAP and see what LDAP says. And what LDAP spat out was this right here. Received access accept. So great, we are done. This means that LDAP had responded to Radius with a certain response code, and Radius knew what that response code was, which was accept. and it spit it out onto our screen. Now let's try it again with a bogus password. Let's remove the 3 and hit enter. You can see that this tries over and over and over again right here. And we can see that this does an access reject this time, which means that the response from LDAP that was given to Radius was translated by Radius and said, oh crap, these aren't right, these credentials aren't right. What we need to do now is edit one more file, and we're going to be editing the etc free radius 3.0 clients.conf file. And what we're going to be doing here is simply creating a secret that our Wi-Fi router will be using to connect to Radius itself. So what I'm going to do is go all the way down to the bottom, and I'm going to create a new section, and I'm going to call it client access point. And this is not JSON, though it kind of looks like it. We're going to do IP adder equals instead of colon, and I'm going to put 192.168.1.1. And why am I putting this? Well, this is because I know that this is the IP address of my Wi-Fi router. This is the default IP address of the Linksys E2500. We're going to see that. We're going to log into it because we need to configure it to set up WPA2 Enterprise and point it at our Radius service on a Raspberry Pi. So the next thing we need to do is add a passphrase or a secret passphrase. So I'm going to put secret, and I'm going to do equals, and this passphrase is going to be used by the Wi-Fi router and passed to Radius. So for here, I'm going to put super secret password. Now I'm going to hit escape, hold shift, hit colon, WQ, enter, boom, we are completely done. Now, let's move on to the next section. The next section now is just simply configuring the Wi-Fi router and then making a test connection. Okay, great. So before we continue, I would first like to cover the actual physical topology of the network as it stands right now. Right now, I'm connected to the internet with my laptop, and my Raspberry Pi is also connected to the internet, and they're both on the same network right here, the physical network that's provided by my typical Wi-Fi router that's in my home. Now, I'm going to be changing this because obviously I need to connect to my E2500 so that I can enable WPA2 Enterprise, and then I have to connect the Raspberry Pi to it and point the Radius service IP address in the actual system configuration of the Wi-Fi router to point to my Raspberry Pi. So now the configuration is going to look like this. And I only need to physically connect my laptop to the E2500 just so that I can access it to configure it. Once I'm done, I'm going to disconnect and connect via Wi-Fi to test the actual WPA2 Enterprise functionality. So now I have completed this step. My physical network now looks like this. I'm now plugged directly into the Wi-Fi router, the E2500, and the Raspberry Pi is also connected to it. Now, because the Raspberry Pi and the laptop switch networks from this device to this device, the IP addresses also change. So now I'm going to have to find the IP address of the Raspberry Pi itself so I can connect to it, start the free Radius service, and then keep that IP address so whenever I go into the actual configuration of the router, I know where to point to for the Radius service that's listening on the Pi. Great, so the first thing I'm going to do is dhclient-v, and I'm going to do this on my Ethernet device. Great, so I'm going to do an ARP-A. I'm going to do a ping Raspberry Pi, and you will see that this did not work. And this is okay. This is because I'm actually using virtualization right now. That's part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that we've switched networks. So this network's so the network stack right now is kind of confused. And it doesn't know where the Raspberry Pi sits. No big deal. All we have to do is open the browser, and we can browse to the actual administration panel inside the Wi-Fi router, the E2500, and we can actually look at all of the devices that are connected to it and look at the DHCP table. Okay, so here I'm now connected, 192.168.1.1. Remember, this is the address that I put into the clients.conf file with the secret of super secret password. I'm going to log in using the default credentials of admin. I'm going to click on status. I'm going to click on local network, and then I'm going to click DHCP client table, and we'll find the IP address of the Raspberry Pi sitting right here. 192.168.1.113. So I'm going to hit X here, and now I'm going to SSH back to that. LPi 192.168.1.113. It's going to ask me for the password, which is Raspberry. I'm going to become root, sudo su, because we're going to be actually starting a service. I'm going to ensure that it's not started, first of all, with free radius stop. Great. Now the service is not running. I'm going to do free radius -d, and we'll do an ampersand. I'm going to do capital X, rather, and we'll do an ampersand. Great. Now we know the service is running. I'm going to get back to the shell, and I'm going to hit Control-D to log out of the server itself. And we now know that Radius is running on it because of this right here. It's ready to process our requests. Great. So now I'm going to go over to wireless. And now I'm going to go to wireless security, and I'm going to switch this from WEP to WPA2 Enterprise. Now, generally, these won't be set up for you. Mine is just cached because I use this router for all of my presentations during class. So it does have values set in it right now. And for my shared key, remember in clients.conf, we put super secret password. I'm going to copy this so I don't have to type it again. Pretty long. I'm going to go down here. We're going to do WPA2 Enterprise, and we're going to see that it's filled in. And this is filled in also. It didn't take it from here. Again, this is just cached because I use this router for class. I use it for all of my demonstrations for my students. I'm going to hit Save Settings. Great. So now the router has WPA2 Enterprise enabled, and it is in fact pointing to our Raspberry Pi, which is running a Radius service. So now all we have to do is test it. And to do this in Linux, it's pretty easy. We just have to ensure that we have a Wi-Fi device. I'm using a USB Wi-Fi device, which is an ALFA adapter. What I'm going to do now is physically disconnect from the E2500. So I have no association to it whatsoever. Great. So now our network topology should look like this. Nothing is connected to this Wi-Fi router, the E2500, except for the Raspberry Pi itself. So heading back over, I'm going to do wicked. We're going to use wicked-client. Great. So now for our wireless network, I'm going to click on my wireless network here, and I'm going to enter in the information here. Use encryption, we're going to choose WPA2 Enterprise without domain. Then I'm going to use WeakNet as the username, and the password was password123. Now again, this information came from that LDIF file that we added into our LDAP directory in the previous part of this lesson. If you want to add more users, you could simply use that same LDIF file and just change the UID, the username, the name, and obviously the password. So I'm going to hit OK. Great. So now we're going to connect to this. We can see that there is little output here, and it's telling us exactly what it's doing. Bringing the interface back up. Now it's validating the authentication, it's obtaining an IP address, and look at that, we've successfully connected to a WPA2 Enterprise wireless security-enabled network that we had just set up with a cheap $33 router and a Raspberry Pi. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and if you have any questions, feel free to tweet me at WeakNetLabs, or you can also email me, weaknetlabs@gmail.com. Thank you so much for watching.